Hey guys, so in today's video we'll be discussing the differences between crosshairs, what makes a good crosshair, and how to find a crosshair that's right for you. Let's get into it. If you're a new player, I'd recommend starting out with Style 4 crosshair just because it's going to be the easiest one to get a grasp of, and it's not too much stuff happening on your screen in regards to the crosshair. Like if you're using Style 3, obviously it's going to be a little wacky getting used to this one. So the next style crosshair we can take a look at is Style 5 crosshair. This is the classic hybrid crosshair, and with this one I'd recommend to players who just really don't know what kind of crosshair they're looking for, but they're more leaning towards that dynamic style of crosshair. This one you just get best of both worlds because it's the classic static whenever you're not shooting, and whenever you're moving it doesn't move as well, but whenever you are shooting it will move the crosshair. So yeah, this one is definitely number 2 right after Style 4. And so the next style crosshair we're looking at is the Style 3. This one is just like Style 5, except when you're moving, it will move. When you shoot, it will move as well. This one's pretty good as well. It will just tell you whenever you have that first bullet accuracy, whenever you stop completely. So whenever you're doing jiggle peaks, it's pretty big, 'cause obviously, just do that to them. And whenever you're spraying as well, you can, obviously, if you're moving with the USP, spraying, keep his head within the crosshair. It's definitely a good crosshair. So with the Style 3 crosshair, it is a great crosshair. I'd probably recommend this to players who maybe struggle with first bullet accuracy. Other than that, if you don't struggle with first bullet accuracy, I'd stick with one of these two. It's definitely number 4. Okay, so the next crosshair we're going to be moving on to is Style 2. This one is definitely, I'd say, my least favorite. It is very hard to see too. I don't know if you can tell. But here, if I look at this darker color, you can see that there's the 4 little dots surrounding the crosshair in the center. And whenever I move, those little dots move. So it's kind of like a dynamic crosshair, but honestly, I wouldn't use this one. I just use, if you're going to use something like this, just use Style 3, honestly. Moving on to Style 1, this one is just a different looking crosshair, honestly. It is quite strange, though. One really nice thing about this is if you look at a player, it will turn red, letting you know that there's a player in your sight. I don't really see, like, there's a benefit to it, but there's also really not, because at the same time, if you're using a regular crosshair, you're going to see the player's name if you're looking at him regardless. I'm not sure about the timings on the crosshair and the name. It looks like the crosshair maybe just barely will blink red before the name pops up, but the advantage really isn't there. But I mean, if you like the style of the crosshair, just give it a go, and if you fall in love with it, keep going with it. Moving on to the last crosshair, we're going to be looking at Style 0. This is the default dynamic one. This one is the same as the Style 1 rather, other than the fact that it's a dynamic crosshair, as you can see. This one, kind of wacky. I wouldn't recommend this one. It's just too much going on. I'd recommend just sticking with something more simple. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to be looking at Style 4 crosshair because that is the crosshair that I use, and I'm going to be showing you guys how to just make the best crosshair possible for you. Okay guys, so once you've figured out which style crosshair you're going to be wanting to use, we're going to be taking a look at how to customize your crosshair, and what to look for and what to look out for when making the crosshair, what can benefit you and what can honestly just ruin your crosshair. So with size, I'd recommend keeping it more slim. You don't want to make it impossible to see, because if this happens, you might just lose your crosshair whenever you're like flicking around or something like that. It is very easy to lose your crosshair if it is this small. I've used crosshairs this small before, and let me tell you, I switched back pretty quickly just because of the fact that I just kept losing it. You also don't want to go too big on the crosshair. You just really want to find that nice center point. And also another thing you can do is line it up. You can also line up your crosshair to where whenever you're pulling down, the crosshair will end on the guy's head. That way you just have to go left to right whenever you're spraying. It's a big thing. Some players used to use it. Not many people use it now. But yeah, it's definitely something you can do. Moving on to the next one, we're going to be looking at thickness. With this one, you just don't really want to go too overboard on the size until it looks like a block. I'd recommend sticking with more slim things. Obviously, you can go like this. You just really don't want it to be too thick to where it's covering people's heads and more or less the angle that you're going to be holding. Moving on from that, we're going to be looking at the gap with this one. You just don't really want to go too big. You can go too small. It really doesn't matter with that. When you go too small, it will obviously just make a little plus sign. These crosshairs aren't bad. Alright guys, so moving on to the gap. With this one, you really just don't want to go too big on it, because if you're holding an angle, it's kind of difficult, especially if it's a long range, like if you're looking down long like this, it's kind of difficult to get that centered headshot one tap in. So I'd recommend just sticking with something more kind of what I have, honestly. What I have, it's perfect for me, because at long range, I can get that centered headshot very easily, but at the same time, if I'm close range on a guy, it's very easy for me to just put my crosshair dead center of his head or just somewhere on his head, and I'll get that one tap. So moving on to the outline. With this one, it's just going to be more personal preference on whether or not you can see your crosshair or not. It will just basically outline your crosshair, obviously, and make it a little bit easier for you to see in game. Okay guys, so moving on to the T-shape. I'd recommend honestly just staying away from this. Just because whenever you're using a regular crosshair, I find it a lot easier to keep your crosshair centered when you do have both the bottom and the top portion of the crosshair. That way you can keep it more centered when you're spraying down and pulling. Moving on from that, we're going to be looking at the dot. I'd recommend just having a dot if you do have a big gap in your crosshair like this. That way you can just always make sure where the center of your crosshair is. When it comes to alpha, I recommend just not changing that. Just keeping it at a solid 255. So moving on from that, for colors, I'm going to have to recommend green, light blue, or red. Green in the number one, just because it is going to be the easiest thing for people to see. Personally, for me, red is the crosshair color that I choose, just because for whatever reason I see red a lot easier than green. I'm not sure why. I think it's just because maybe the vibrance GUI or the saturation on my screen that I have. But it just makes it a little bit easier for me to see, which is nice. Light blue, I used to use the light blue. This one stands out a lot, obviously. Makes it pretty easy for you to tap heads. Moving on from the crosshair color, we're going to be looking at the dot hair. With this, I would just honestly recommend just staying with a regular crosshair. And I've used both crosshairs for probably a year. I probably used the dot hair for over a year, and then the regular crosshair for the rest of the time. But with the dot hair, it is great. Let me tell you, it is great for tapping heads. Like, look at how easy it is for me to just tap the heads of people. It's just so simple. Just place the crosshair dead center, or just on the guy's head, basically. But the one thing that really sucks about this crosshair is if, for example, you're holding long and there's a guy in pit, and he peeks his head into your crosshair, you will not see him. If it is at this angle, you will not see him. Maybe you'll catch a shoulder, maybe at the top of his head, barely. But I've died too many times because of my crosshair just being on his head and him peeking and me not seeing his head because my crosshair is in front of it. That is the sole reason why I switched over to a regular crosshair instead of using the dot hair. And with the crosshair, you're going to just want to really keep it small, simple, but also noticeable. You don't want it to be too small to where it's obviously just the 4 little pixels like I showed earlier in the video. You don't want that. It will you'll lose your crosshair. When it comes to colors, obviously red, green, and light blue. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and just remember that this will be a trial and error process. Like, it took me years to really find like a perfect crosshair for me. So I really do hope you guys did enjoy. I hope the information within the video was helpful, and have a good rest of your day.